Hi, welcome back to our study going through the book of Isaiah. This is video number 18, and it is a ministry of the Port Huron Church of Christ. We're at 756 17th Street in Port Huron, Michigan. So, I hope that you've had a good week. I hope that this video finds you well. So, let's dive in. Our last several videos, we noticed the major shift in the theme of Isaiah, beginning with chapter 40. And how it is switched from doom and gloom and impending punishment because of idolatry and social injustice and corrupt leadership and so forth, and it has made this shift to comfort of God's people. So last week we revisited the fact of God's eternal nature, His divine power, and the comfort that He will provide, and the challenge to say, who is like our God? And so God is challenging not only the people of Judah at this time, but it's a challenge for us. You can look at everything in all creation and realize that there is absolutely no one, no thing in all of creation that can compare to the greatness of our God. So we are going to pick up with chapter 41 this lesson. And chapter 41 is a very strong messianic chapter in Isaiah. Sometimes Isaiah has even been referred to as the fifth gospel, or the pre-gospel, if you will, because the book of Isaiah contains so many messianic prophecies that Jesus would later fulfill when he was on the scene. So Isaiah chapter 41 is extremely messianic in nature, but as always, I ask you to take what you know about the New Testament, put it on the back burner for just a few moments, and we're going to look at what the text would have meant to the original audience, to Judah that was about to be taken captivity into Babylon, to the little remnant of God's people that had made a mistake, and yes, they would be punished, they would be corrected, but there would also be restoration, because God loves them. Despite their failures and their faults, just like us. So let's first take a look at what the text would have meant with the original audience, and of course we will work in what we know about Jesus as we go. Okay? So Isaiah chapter 41, not only does Israel have a God like no other God, but He has promised to help. And if you remember last week's lesson, we learned that only God can truly keep His promises to the utmost degree, because He is eternal and He is all-powerful. So Isaiah chapter 41, I want to bring up the fact, too, that this is not just words. This isn't just nice, lofty speech. God has, and He will, back this promise of help with action. So Isaiah chapter 41, beginning at verse 1. Be silent before me, you islands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together at the place of judgment. By the way, sorry if you hear the little dog yapping. If the wind blows, she thinks something's up. So let us meet together at the place of judgment. Verse 2. Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him, and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them, and moves on unscathed, by the path his feet have not traveled before. Who has done this, and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? It is I, the Lord, with the first of them, and with the last. I am He. So God is referencing the Babylonians now. He's saying, who has the power to raise up a king or an empire like the Babylonians, and they trample through whatever they see? And, we saw how terrifying the Assyrian army was to Israel and to Judah, especially to Judah. And God says, don't worry about them, I'll take care of it. Of course, we learned before how God miraculously took care of the army of Assyria, which was just vastly greater than the little forces of Judah. So now it's Babylon, and it's this empire that makes the Assyrians look like altar boys. So God is saying, who can raise up an empire like this? Who can bring forth a king to do my bidding, basically? Who can do this? And the answer, of course, is only Yahweh, only God. And we do have to remember that we could look at an army or any kind of power in the earth and realize or remember that the one behind that amazing empire, the one behind that awesome power, is always so much greater than that empire or that power itself. And that's God. So here, again, we have God reassuring the people that he is not only capable, but he is willing to help. And this action that we spoke of was the fact that here comes the Babylonians. And who has the power? Who has the ability to raise up an empire and a king like this? Only God. So, moving on. This is God promising to help. And just a little side note here, I'd like to give a huge thank you to the folks at the Port Huron Church of Christ who try to follow in the same footsteps. We realize that we serve an amazing and awesome God. And because we love him, we do the best we can to love other people. And in all the time that I have spent in the military and different careers and traveling around, I've lived in northern Michigan, California, Ohio, Florida, Texas, and in every place there have always been good people of God. But I do have to say, here at the Port Huron Church of Christ, these folks really do put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. They put their hand to the plow, and I just want to say thank you. Whether you were involved with helping someone move into a new apartment recently, that was great. So many hands, and it just made the work so easy and so quick. So thank you for showing up. Maybe you weren't the one. Maybe your days of lifting couches is over. I want to thank you for your prayers, or maybe you sent a card, or maybe you helped do some cleaning or something like that. So I just want to say thank you again to the folks here at the church. And an obvious invitation. If you're watching this video and you do not have a church home, you're not only welcome to invited to check out like the worship service on Sunday morning. And yes, we're practicing social distancing, and we ask that you wear a mask, and there's hand sanitizer and all that jazz because of COVID-19. But you're also invited to the things that happen Monday through Friday. And things are a little slowed right now because of everything going on. But COVID won't last forever. And when things return to some degree of normalcy, the real good stuff happens Monday through Friday. You know what I mean? It's where people are doing life together. And they don't just say that they'll pray for you, they do pray for you. And I just want to say thanks to my family there at the Port Huron Church of Christ, and let you know that you are always welcome. And I hope that, if you have a church home, we're not interested in stealing sheep from another pen. But if you don't, you're always welcome to anything and everything. So I just want to say thanks again to the folks there for stepping up and really trying to put some hustle behind the muscle and being the church, not just going to church. So thanks, guys. Pressing on here, we're going to see in the text a little more reason why we can trust that God is capable of helping through any situation. So let's pick up here with verse 5. And by the way, this issue of the islands, we've seen this word a couple times in the text, and he says, you islands, or let the islands, or something. The islands refer to the nations, the continents in the world. So you basically had little Israel, which was, it's nestled right between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and Israel and Judah, they're all, there's this little stretch here between, it goes from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, and it goes up basically to where the desert begins, and it goes down roughly to the Dead Sea, or sometimes it's called the Sea of Salt. So that's basically the little patch of real estate. And so when God refers to the islands, he's talking about the other continents in the world, the other nations of the world. So here we go, back to verse 5. The islands have seen it, and they fear. Now, what is it they have seen and they fear? They have seen nations rise and fall. They have seen this mighty strength called the Assyrians, and they saw God basically take care of it. Now they are witnessing the Babylonian Empire come to power. And they are witnessing this, they are well aware of it, and God says, the islands have seen it, and they fear. Don't mean to interrupt here, but I need to close a curtain because the sun came out. Hold just a second. All right, that's a little better. I'm pasty enough. You don't need the sun shining on my bald head blinding you. So the nations have seen this, and they are afraid. Because up to this point, they haven't seen. They thought the Assyrians were bad news and tough, and they're nothing compared to the Babylonians, and they're a little scared. So God says the nations see this, or the islands see it, and they are afraid. Verse 5 here, the ends of the earth, they tremble. They approach and come forward. They help each other, and they say to their companions, be strong. Now remember, he's talking about the idolatrous nations of the world. Verse 7, the metal worker encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes the anvil. The one of the welding, one says of the welding, it is good, and the other nails down the idol so it will not topple. So basically, God is saying that, hey, nobody's ever seen something like Babylon on the way. And so these pagan nations are going to try and comfort and encourage each other. And they're going to say, hey, be strong, guys. Let's make a bigger idol. Let's make a better idol. Let's encourage one another to make an idol to protect us. And remember, this isn't Israel or Judah. These are the islands. These are the other nations of the world. And God is basically saying, this is what they think. This is what they do. This is what they do when they're afraid. This is what they do when they see trouble coming. They try to take care of it themselves. They make an idol. And even though they would worship this idol, I'm just wondering if it occurred to them that they're the ones that fashioned it in the first place. So I don't know really what they were thinking, but I know that our society today has the same problem. It's just that we don't have statues of gold and silver. We see trouble coming, and what do? We put our faith in money, or we put our faith in the government, or we put our faith in this candidate or that candidate, and we say they will make it right. And we talked last week about the futility, the uselessness of worshiping and serving created things. And God's going to do a little more of this poking in the chest of these idols. And he's going to say, you think you're big and bad, you're nothing. And he's going to kind of poke mankind in the chest and say, you think that what you can do is going to help you, and I'm promising you it's nothing compared to what I can do, is what God says. So he's going to do a little bit more of that because God detests idolatry. So they're encouraging one another. They're going to set themselves up an idol. And this is reason why we cannot, or why we can trust what God is capable of doing, and the fact that he will help. Because the first 4 verses we saw that Yahweh is the one responsible for world history. Yahweh is the one that orchestrates a kingdom when it rises and when it falls. Not an idol, not even us. So this is why we can trust God and God alone. Look at verses 5 through 7. The islands, the nations are scurrying to put their faith in an idol, but this is not to be the case with Israel, with Judah. This is not to be the case with you and I as Christ followers. Okay, verse 5. We're moving on here we already did 5 through 7. So verses 8 through 16. Yahweh and Israel, Judah, as well as for the Christian, we have a special or a covenant relationship with God. Look at verse 8, and we're going to read through verse 16. He says, the nations are going to set up an idol, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob. So you've got Israel, which would have been the north, Jacob, all right, which was sometimes referred to Judah as well, Judah and Israel. Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend. That's huge. I took you from the ends of the earth. This is verse 9. From the farthest corners I called you, and I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and have not rejected you. So do not fear. Now remember, just a few verses ago, he said the islands or the other nations fear because they hear of this rising empire and they make an idol. He said, but you do not fear, for I am with you. This is the rest of verse 10. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. So here we see that Yahweh is in this special covenant relationship with the children of Israel, with the children of Judah. And this comes to an even greater fulfillment, of course, for the Christian. But for here, this special relationship goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. There was this cat named Abram, who God would later change his name to Abraham. And this was how God kind of launched it all. He started this whole thing with a chosen people and his plan of what to do with the world and how he was going to accomplish it. So if you take a look at Genesis chapter 12, you will find what I like to call the 4 P's, the letter P. And the 4 P's are a place, a people, a privilege, and a purpose. These were the 4 things that God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham, or at the time his name was Abram, and his descendants after him. So for right now, we're just going to limit it to the Old Testament portion of this. But if you've gotten to Genesis chapter 12, beginning at verse 1, here we go. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you. So that's our first P, a place. God assured Abraham and his descendants what we would call the promised land. It's not just the promised land, it's promised. ED, there's an ED on the end of it. Promised land. This was the stretch of real estate that we mentioned earlier between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, from the desert mountain range down to the Dead Sea. This is the real estate, the place that God had guaranteed Abraham and his descendants. So there's the place, the first promise. He says in verse 2, I will make you into a great nation and bless you. This is a reference to the people. If we recap a little bit of history here, this promise was made to Abraham and his wife, who had no children. And Abraham took his nephew Lot and Lot's wife, who he wasn't supposed to do in the first place, but basically you had 4 of them. And this promise continued even after Abraham mistakenly took matters into his own hands regarding descendants because of this promise of being a great nation. He tried to have a surrogate child through an Egyptian maid by the name of Hagar. That was the child Ishmael. And later, of course, the child of the promise would be Isaac, a child that came from Abraham and his wife Sarah. So even if you however you want it, you're talking, 4, maybe 6 people tops. We know that if you fast forward all the way to the time of Joseph, so you would have Abraham, whose son's name was Isaac, and then Isaac. He also had 2 boys, Esau and Jacob would be the guy that wrestles with God, and God changes his name to Israel. And Jacob has 12 boys, which would be known as the 12 tribes of Israel. The story of Joseph is after that, where the brothers sell Joseph, who at the time was the youngest. He would end up being the second from the youngest. There would be another son, Benjamin, later. But this whole thing where Joseph is sold into slavery, he ends up as vice president of Egypt. which was the largest, most powerful nation at the time. And he invites he's restored to his brothers and his father, and he invites them to come live with him in Egypt. And I think the text says there was about 70 some people that went into Egypt as guests of Joseph, the Israelites that went to Egypt. And then, of course, you fast forward 400 and some odd years later, and now there's just so many Israelites that you can't count them. They have multiplied, and they have become a great people, a nation unto themselves. So this was the second promise given to Abraham, a great people. And the readers of Isaiah would have been very familiar with this, because the vast majority of their brothers and sisters have been taken captive to Assyria. And now Babylon is coming in. And there's just going to be a few of them left. There isn't even enough of them left to fight a battle on their own. So this is the deal with the people. Going on to Genesis 12 again, he continues with verse 2, and he says, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. This was the privilege. This was the third P. The privilege of being in special relationship with Yahweh. Whoever blesses Israel will be blessed by God. Whoever curses Israel will be cursed by God. Whoever stands with Israel can stand. Whoever stands against Israel will fall, because God is for them. That was the privilege, special relationship with God. And finally, the last part of verse 3, he says, and all the people of the earth will be blessed through you. Not just Israel, not just Judah, but all people of the earth. And if you want this week, if you take a look at the book of Ephesians and read it very slowly, the Apostle Paul talks about this mystery that has been hidden since the time of Abram. And that mystery is that God was waiting until Jesus was here physically to do his thing with his perfect life, his death on the cross, and his resurrection. That was the time that God would reveal that he even intended for the Gentiles, which are non-Jewish people, non-Israelites, to be part of God's original plan of being a blessing to all nations. That one of Abraham's descendants would bless all the nations of the world. Okay? And we bring this up because in verses 8 through 16, again, back to Isaiah chapter 41, in 8 through 16, we said that the descendants of Abraham were his friends. He took you from the ends of the earth, called you my servant. I haven't rejected you. I'm with you. And at the end of verse 16, he said, I will strengthen you and help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous hand. Now, look at verse 11. 11 says, all who rage against you will surely be ashamed and disgraced. Those who oppose you will be as nothing and perish. That was that privilege. Whoever blesses Israel will be blessed by God. Whoever stands against Israel will be standing against God himself. Verse 12. Though you may search for your enemies, you won't find any. Those who wage war against you will be as nothing at all. For I am the Lord your God, and take hold of you your right hand, and say to you, do not fear, I will help you. Do not be afraid, you worm Jacob, little Israel, do not fear. Now, God isn't calling Jacob a worm, like a derogatory. He's saying that you know that you're helpless. You know that you're small. We talked last week about the insignificance of all mankind's accomplishments, good or bad, and how they amount to nothing compared to God. So that's what worm Jacob referred to here in verse 14. He goes on and he says, for I myself will help you, declares the Lord. You need to remember the Holy One of Israel. See, I will make you into a threshing sledge, new and sharp, with many teeth. You will thresh the mountains and crush them, and reduce the hills to chaff. You will winnow them. The wind will pick them up, and a gale will blow them away. But you will rejoice in the Lord and glory in the Holy One of Israel. So here, this is just a restatement that God is saying, hey, there's no God like me, And I'm going to continue to keep my promise way back, made to Abraham. And don't worry, Israel. Again, it's going to be tough, but I'm going to restore you. This is why you can trust God, because He is so awesome, He is so mighty, He is capable and able to do it. So this is the answer to the nations that are enemies of God people. So this is what it meant to them. This was a promise restated from their past that they saw come to pass in amazing, miraculous ways, time after time after time. So now, what do we do with this? Well, we are not Israel. Unless you are of genetic descent Jewish, you're a Gentile. And when you get into, in fact, Lamar touched on this last week in his sermon, that in the book of Ephesians, there's no such thing as Jew or Gentile, slave or free, even male or female, in regard to your status with God. He loves you, and you are His child if you are in Christ. You are in special covenant relationship with God Almighty because of your faith in His Son, Jesus, who is called the Christ. So, with that in mind, what do we do with this? The same thing Israel did. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. Do not lose hope, no matter what's going on. Because God has this. He's been in charge of civilizations and empires rising and falling from the start of time. He's got this. And He's got you. So don't worry. Put your faith and your trust in Him. Now, moving on. This was the answer to the nations that put their hope in idols. In verses 17 through 20, we will also see God help the poor, the social injustice. We will see that God will help them, and He does it for the sake of His glory. So look at verses 17 through 20. Verse 17, the poor and the needy search for water, but there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst, but I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will make rivers flow on barren heights, and springs within their valleys. I will turn the desert into pools of water, and the parched ground into springs. I will put in the desert the cedar and the acacia, the myrtle and the olive. I will set junipers in the wasteland and fir in the cypress together, so that people may see and know, that they may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, that the Holy One of Israel has created it. So again, God has not only addressed the issue of idolatry, but also the social injustice, the abuse of the poor, the leadership is a given. All right, you want a whole nation putting their faith in God. You don't want the leaders being corrupt again. So God is going to remedy all the things that plagued and hindered the nation of Judah that led to their punishment and their captivity. The rest of the chapter here, verses 21 through 29, is more of Yahweh's disdain for idolatry. And he's taunting the idols. He's taunting anyone who puts their faith in an idol. Why does He do this? Because we know that even from the first commandment that God ever gave to Moses, that you should have no other gods before me. Why? Because He is a jealous God. The second commandment was that you should not fashion for yourself or make an idol of any kind. He is the only God. He despises graven images because they are nothing. They're absolutely nothing. And God is a jealous God. He is jealous for you because He loves you. He is jealous about His glory. He is the Creator. He is the Savior. He has done everything, and He will share His glory with no one. And who can blame Him? So, very quickly, let's look at one last thing about God's disdain for idols. This is verse 21. Present your case, says the Lord. Set forth your arguments, says Jacob's king. Tell us, you idols, what's going to happen next. Tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know their final outcome. This is God being cheeky here. Verse 23, or declare us the things to come. Verse 23, tell us what the future holds. so that we may know that you are God's. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. But you are less than nothing, and your works are utterly worthless. Whoever chooses you is detestable. Verse 25. I have stirred up one from the north, and he comes. One from the rising sun who calls on my name. He treads on rulers as if they were mortar, as if they were a potter treading the clay. Who told you of this from the beginning so that we could know? Or beforehand, so we could say he was right? No one told of this. No one foretold it. No one heard any words from you. And of course he's referencing the idols. I was the first. This is God saying, I was the first to tell Zion, look, here they are. I gave to Jerusalem a messenger of good news. I look, but there is no one among the other gods to give counsel. No one to give answer when I ask them. Do you see? They are all false. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are but wind and confusion. So again, this is God kind of poking idolatry in the chest. And he's making fun of them. And he says, do something, do anything, so that we could know you're real. Do good or bad, so that we know that you're there. Now, let me close with this. I know that in my life, I have been tempted to ask the same thing of God. God, where are you? I can't see you. I can't hear you. I can't feel you. I feel forsaken. I feel abandoned. I feel rejected. And the temptation is, you want to look at God and say, God, do something, anything, just so that I know that you're there, just so that I know you're listening. And that is a grave mistake on our part. That is treating God like a lump of wood, overlaid with gold, like an idol. That's treating God superstitiously, because God said, I have already done so many things. And what you perceive as my silence is really just me stretching your faith and asking you to trust me for this long. Just trust me this much. And if you have trouble trusting me, just look at all the things I've done beforehand. Take a look outside and look at the beauty of my creation. Look at the stars at night and look at my majesty, because the stars proclaim my glory. This is what God is saying to us, and he's asking us to trust him this much. So, if you're like me and you've ever fallen into that trap where you're looking at God and you're going, please do something, anything, so that I know that you're there, you need to not do that. You need to just be still and know that he's God. And this is kind of what God is saying to Judah here. He's saying, yep, there's going to be punishment, but I want you to consider all the things I've done in the past, and I want you to consider that I've never broken my word, and I never will. Next week, we're going to look even more. Chapter 42 is where the messianic stuff really, really comes into play. And he talks about his servant and how his spirit is on him and the way his servant will live and walk and talk and just be. And next week is going to be very, very encouraging. If you're wrestling with anything, hang in there. Just be still. Know that he's God. And just look around at the glory and the majesty of what he's created. And just let your heart be at ease. So, until next time, God bless, and we'll see you later.